Thanks. Yeah, I'm Ilja Honkonen and I'm at the Goddard Space Flight Center near DC, and I'll talk to you about C++11 in space plasma model development. So here's the outline of the talk. So quite long introduction, and then I'll go through some of the algorithms and methods and optimizations that one really has to use when modeling space plasma. Otherwise it's not gonna finish in our lifetime. And then more kind of high level or complicated stuff, so the coupling of different models and then frameworks, and so those kind of then lead to the variadic templates, which kind of make that stuff, at least I think it makes it a lot easier. So first of all, what is plasma? So it's a fundamental state of matter, same as gas, liquid and solid. And basically plasma consists of some charged particles. The exact fraction of charge to neutral, it can vary quite a lot, and it depends on the case when it is actually good to call something a plasma. But so yeah, basically, and a charged particle then is for example an electron or a proton, or then an atom with a different number of bound electrons than the number of protons in its nucleus. And so what makes this different from, or plasma different from other matter, is that there is this electromagnetic force which affects charged particles, and neutral particles don't feel it or they feel it to a much smaller extent. I think this is the only equation in the presentation. So the force on a charged particle is the charge, and then multiplied by the electric field plus then the cross product of the particle's velocity and the magnetic field at the particle position. And one fundamental difference is that plasma exhibits collective behavior, even though the system would be collisionless. So for example, at the Earth's distance from the Sun, the mean free path of the particles, so the average distance that particles travel before they collide with some other particle, it's about the same as the distance from Earth from the Sun. So it's really a collisionless system. But nevertheless, there are all kinds of interactions between the waves and the particles, and also there are many types of waves instead of, for example, just the acoustic wave in neutral gas or a liquid. And even in the magnetohydrodynamic theory, there are 3 different wave types, and then when you go to more complicated theories of plasma, then you get more waves also. And so then some motivation on why to study plasma. First of all, it's 5/9% of the observable universe is in the plasma state. So pretty much the only exception are the neutral atmospheres of planets. Everything else pretty much is in the plasma state. And also the parameter range of plasma is significantly bigger than any of the other states of matter. So for example, density of plasma can vary 30 orders of magnitude from 10 particles per cubic meter, about this big volume, in intergalactic space, to then 10 to the 31 particles per cubic meter inside of the center of the Sun, for example. And this also holds for different other variables. So for example, the magnetic field the minimum is, well, less than a nanotesla in intergalactic space, and on the other hand it's like 10 to the 11 Tesla in well, collapsed stars, which left a neutron star, and then if it happens to have a very large magnetic field, then it can be, well, 20 orders of magnitude larger than, for example, in near Earth space or the solar wind at Earth. And also the time scales are vary quite a lot. So there is the 11-year or, well, 22-year sunspot cycle, which also affects the, well, entire heliosphere in some form. And then there is like this, well, kilohertz electron oscillations, which also play an important role in some plasma physics. And, well, yeah, the spatial scale start from like 10 meters or 1 meter for the charge separation between the protons and the electrons, and then you have like the heliosphere and like light years long, all kinds of structures. So it's a very diverse system. And so, well, it's very challenging to model from like purely physics point of view, to just understand what you're trying to model or if you're modeling it correctly. And then computational physics, there's a lots of all kinds of algorithms and optimizations and whatnot that you can apply to the problem. And also from purely computational science, at least nowadays, it's once you get away from the legacy codes, then there is more room for actual computer science also. And well, practical motivation is that there are no direct measurements outside of the solar system, and even direct measurements inside are very expensive, well, hundreds of millions of whatever monetary units you can think of. And anyway, if you launch a bunch of satellites, it's still few point measurements in a system which is millions of miles long and so on. So the measurements are very sparse, and it can take, well, decades from initial planning to launching actually some big satellite mission. So there is also a very big lag, or can be, in the measurements. And so modeling helps to understand and even predict all kinds of, well, fundamental physics and also hazards. For example, there was a large blackout in 1989 in Canada due to a geomagnetic storm, which cut off the power from millions of people for several hours or more, I think, causing a lot of damage also, as well, if monetary damage. And more regularly, there are, well, at regular intervals, very high energy particles around the geostationary orbit, which can cause all kinds of trouble to satellites and manned missions and whatnot, communications. And, well, high energy in this case means higher than a fusion reactor, for example, or much higher. And also the exponential increase in computational power for, well, many decades has actually enabled a lot of the modeling that was, well, couldn't be even imagined few tens of years ago. And so the new bottlenecks actually starts to be like development of the models and then just making sure that they work as expected and then actually reproduce something in reality. And so then numerical modeling, well, for example, of space plasma, basically it's, well, you numerically solve one or more equations in some kind of a volume representing some physical system. It's up to 6 dimensions if you, for example, have a particle with position and velocity. So that's a 6-dimensional system right there. And the main point is that the analytic solution is not known or does not even exist. And so then you have to, well, have some kind of numerical approximation and then try to solve it numerically or approximate the true solution to the equations numerically, and then try to see if the equations or the solution actually represent reality. And so, well, in math, all of the equations and variables and the volume are just continuous, but for computers they have to be discretized. And actually, this has the Conway's game of life, I assume everyone here knows what that is, so I won't go into that. But basically that's a very good analogy for many of the models. So you actually, I think that's on the next slide. So you have some volume which consists of basically cells. Well, the shape can vary, so like rectangles or hexagonal or triangular or all kinds of shapes. And then, well, the variables are just in each cell there is something stored. So whether the cell is alive or the density, temperature, or kind of the velocity space in real space. So then there's a velocity grid in every spatial cell or stuff like that. And then the equations basically are just a collection of functions which take in the state in a cell and some distance around it, and then output the next state of some variables in the cell. And so the number of neighbors which is required, it's quite problem and dimension and independent, and also the algorithm you're using and so on. So, well, game of life is in 2 dimensions. It's 8 neighbors, for example. But well, in practice it gets a lot more complicated than this. So one problem is the computational complexity, or maybe the main problem. Well, I'll use as an example the Earth's magnetosphere, which is here illustrated by an artist. So basically the magnetosphere is the region of space which is dominated by the Earth's magnetic field instead of the sun's. And so here you can see that the constant or solar wind, which is just the flux of plasma which is constantly emitted by the sun and then blown away. So it hits the Earth's magnetic field, and well, this is also supersonic it's faster than any of the waves in the system, so it kind of creates this bow shock here, and then it stretches the magnetic field of Earth to millions of miles away, and then compresses on the day side. So this is basically the system I'll be using as an example. So let's take a crude estimate. So you have a density of like 1 million particles per cubic meter, or 1 particle in about this size volume. And for example, Wikipedia lists that 10 to the 10 particles per cubic meter is already extremely high vacuum. So this is also much more vacuous than anything that can be done in a laboratory. So this is also, space is also a very good plasma laboratory, because you can't replicate many of the conditions on Earth. And so then volume, so the tail, it's like 1 million miles or a bit more, but close enough. And so then you get 10 to the 25 cubic meters, and then so you have an n-body problem with 10 to the 31 particles or bodies. And to put it into a perspective, this is kind of the back of the envelope calculations, maybe XKCD style. So let's see how much memory would be required to just store this on a computer. So let's see, 6 floats or doubles per particle. So underestimated a bit, so 10 to the 32 bytes. And then there was a reference on Wikipedia for some scientists managed to store, was it about 10 bytes in 1 particle. So let's assume it was silicone, or I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but the chemical formula is there. So it would be about 10 to the 24 bytes per gram of matter. And so it would take about 100 million grams, or literally tons of memory to just store the thing. So this is the International Space Station. It wouldn't be that much heavier than the memory required to just store the system. and then the floating point operations required to do something with the system. So assume again that the highest frequency, well, if all the particles are modeled, it's about 10 kilohertz, and then we simulate it for 1 day. Oh no, it's 100,000 hertz, yeah, and 100,000 seconds. So you get about 10 to the 42 floating point operations, and well, this year / next year, the sum of the top 500 fastest computers is like 10 to the 18 flops per second. So, well, the increase has been about 1 million times every 20 years. So in 50 years, this simulation would finish in 30 years. And then maybe in 2075, it would take only a few weeks or something. So it's, yeah, not in my, at least not during my professional life. And then, well, the energy required is also quite significant. So the best computer now in green 500 is about 10 to the 10 flops per joule. So it would take 10 to the 32 joules to calculate the simulation, and the entire energy output of the sun is, well, 10 to the 27 watts. So actually you could do real-time simulations if you just use the entire energy output of the sun. So you simulate 100,000 seconds, and then you get get this amount of energy. And well, there have also been some theoretical work in this. So assuming like 100 Kelvin temperature, it would take about 10 to minus 21 joules to flip 1 bit. So assuming it takes, like, I think this is well, I don't know, this might be a conservative or underestimate, but assuming like 1,000 flips correspond to 1 floating point operation. So it would take 10 to 24 joules to simulate or run the program. And the solar constant at Earth, well, it's about 1,400 something watts per square meter, but let's take an crude estimate. So about 10 to 17 watts per, or the total energy or solar energy at Earth. So if you use the entire output of the sun at Earth or to the surface of the Earth, then you could do about, 100 times slower than real time, which is, well, maybe manageable, but still. So it's kind of, well, maybe in 50-60 years, big maybe. But then the next question is, so what about the entire heliosphere? So then you multiply the volume by 100, and then you multiply the density by, well, millions or billions, and the highest frequency, and also the energy then starts to become like ridiculous. And this is just classical physics, so no quantum mechanics or anything like that. So it's really, it's not feasible to model the entire, well, magnetosphere probably ever, but at least like 50 years doesn't look at all likely. So you have to use a lot of physical approximations, well, or start from them. So the first one is actually, well, solve fewer particles. So usually, yeah, the number of particles solved is like 20 orders of magnitude less than there actually are in the system. And, well, the more you use or the more you solve, the less noisy, let's say, the results will be, and the better. But that's still, at least at this point, that's not enough. So then you actually have to start neglecting some physics. So if you neglect electron physics, then you immediately reduce the computational complexity by about 1 million, and then it also depends on the number of dimensions you have. So if it's a 3D system, then it's, what was it? Yeah, so now should that be actually? Yeah, that should be actually a multiplication here. But anyway, so yeah, it's, yeah, if for 3D system you reduce the computational complexity by 10 to the power of 12 or something like that, so a very significant amount. And then the kind of maybe the crudest approximation is this magnetohydrodynamics assumption. So you assume that the plasma is a magnetized fluid, which then in principle requires that the system should be collisional also in the, well, kind of the point or head-on collision sense, but which the near-Earth space, for example, is not. But this assumption still works surprisingly well, at least in the or far enough from Earth, so outside of the geostationary orbit. This is a pretty good assumption. And well, this is quite light, so the real-time space weather forecasting has been going on for at least in kind of this prototype/testing capacity for over a decade now. So this is already quite light computationally. And these last two, so they are not approximation or not optimizations, because some results, or actually if you neglect or if you do this, quite many things will be wrong no matter how much resolution or computational time you use, because the physics just isn't there. And so, well, my research is changing the physical approximation during the simulation based on, well, if something interesting happens to happen somewhere, then you could use a better approximation there. And so then these could be considered already optimizations in the sense that the physics doesn't change, but then again, you can get like a 10 orders of magnitude speed up, so I wouldn't call that an optimization, but well, that's a kind of depends on who you ask how much or which factor of speed up you should get before you stop calling it an optimization. So the first one I'll talk about is the kind of the discretization of the space or the volume. So you have some kind of a grid and then you approximate it with cells or vertices. Well, it's a graph basically anyway. So cells or vertices, edges, whatever. And so with very good gridding, in certain cases you can improve or reduce the number of required cells by 10 orders of magnitude, but well, that's not very not usually, but it's still a very important technique in many cases. And so then the kind of how you implement the grid just from a software development point of view, so well, there is always a trade-off between how easy it is to use and how much time it takes to implement it, and then those I guess are the most important ones. And so especially these fully unstructured grids, so you have just triangles or tetrahedras of basically any shape in the system, so that gets also quite complicated for the kind of writing the solvers which kind of calculate the physics then. And one which is, at least in my case, has been important is this adaptive mesh refinement. So basically you change the structure of the grid while the simulation is going on. So then you can, for example, put more resolution in interesting places depending on how the system is evolving. And so basically it looks like this. Well, this is I'll use the canonical game of life here. So here you see the glider gliding on the diagonal, and then in this case the cells are refined or coarsened randomly. So in some cases you see that there is in 2 dimensions it's 4 smaller cells, and then they disappear, and then there is one big one instead. But so basically it means that during the run some cells are refined and some are coarsened, and there's then this number of times that a cell can be refined. It can be anything from a few times to 10, and then you get this a factor of or 10 orders of magnitude difference in the number of cells if you really refine in some cases where it's necessary. And so with AMR you can put resolution where needed or where you want the resolution. So if you have a big system and you're interested in only in some small part, then you can model the entire system, so have like a kind of consistent boundary or behavior in global scale, and then like really good resolution somewhere where something interesting is happening. There are also these grid-free methods. Well, it's kind of, they're still, well, this is almost like a general graph, so the vertices are moving quite arbitrarily, and then the edges switch from between different vertices, so the neighbors of the cells change. So this is quite tricky business, and well, yeah, there is no game of life analogy for this because the cells are moving and the neighbors of each cell can change. And this is best for systems when there is, well, especially if you want to resolve the movement, and then like the fine details kind of well, or if you kind of, well, yeah, it's this is, I haven't seen this used that much, although there are some situations where this is at least a very good idea. And then the solvers, so higher order solvers are, well, usually a good idea. So basically the error of the solution decreases faster if you use more cells than with a lower order solver, or then if it's a kind of a high order temporal solver or in time, then you can take longer time steps, which kind of, well, reduce the time to solution, but these are, or then, well, increase the amount of data you have to gather from around the cell to calculate the new state. And well, these are also, well, mathematically these can be also tricky to design, and then the implementation can also be difficult, especially with adaptive mesh refinement. Then another class are the implicit solvers. So basically the next time step appears on both sides of the assignment operation, so to say. So then you have to use some kind of an iterative solver to kind of maybe converge to some good solution. So these can also be very tricky to at least make to work, but then when they do, they can increase the time step by a factor of 1,000, and so then the time to solution can decrease substantially. Another class is the substepping. So especially in systems where the kind of the maximum time step you can take just from a mathematics point of view is limited by something, so it can vary quite a lot in the different parts of the system. So then you take the local maximum time step everywhere, and then you use some kind of a higher level synchronization to kind of have the whole thing still work. So these can also, especially, well, these can also reduce the diffusion or make kind of the interesting boundaries sharper and stuff like that. But that's also additional work away from physics. Now, well, yeah, so then this concurrency business. First I'll talk about distributed memory concurrency. So basically what happens is that, well, process 2 has these cells, process 1 has these cells, and then they have a copy of the other process's cells, which is then updated after every time step. So basically the new solution is calculated, then these cells are copied here and these cells are copied here, and then you can calculate the next solution. And so yeah, this is basically what happens. And so then the details, again, they depend a lot on the problem and the method of solution of the problem. For example, the distance from which you have to copy the data depends on the solver and also order of the solver. So higher order solvers usually they require a longer distance to copy from. So this increases communication, which might affect scalability or might not. And then also how frequently the data has to be copied. That also depends on the solver and also the problem. And for example, if there are these higher order temporal solvers, they can take several sub-steps. Or if you're, and if you have several models which have a different time-stepping strategy, then you have to be careful to send the right data, but try not to send too much so that the simulation still works quickly. And so in distributed memory programming, at least for high-performance computing, the message passing interface is pretty much the standard and has been now for like 20 years. And so the API is quite simple. So you have a buffer and then you send from it or receive to it a type or a number of types and from a certain process. And note that both the sender and the receiver must know the amount of data that is being sent. So, as far as I guess message passing goes, this is quite low level, but this at least it works fast. And at the best, depending, if you have a large enough supercomputer, you can get like a factor of 10,000 speed up compared to any one PC or even a pretty big server. So it's like you can use like hundreds of thousands of cores on the largest machines. But this depends on, or you have to use scalable algorithms, and also overlapping computational communication is always a good idea. But so this speed up I wouldn't call an optimization, but then there are also other ones. So shared memory, it's like a factor of 1,000 times less speed up than from the previous one. So this might be an optimization, and especially if you implement the distributed memory parallel program, then the speed up you can get on a single PC with threading it's not that much larger anymore, because MPI can also be optimized for shared memory systems. And OpenMP has been the usual, or maybe the one quite popular way to do this, and now this C++11 is also looking quite good for this work. And shared memory concurrency is becoming more and more important as the core counts increase. But the Xeon Phi, I guess, is the first one where at least the vendor is saying that you really can't do this with MPI, you have to use threading. But this shared memory concurrency, game of life example, so you have one equation, and then you have one variable. Basically, it's in the equation, and then you have to have another one in practice to record the number of live neighbors before you can update the next state. So you have two variables. So pretty much the simulation then goes, each cell calculates the number of live neighbors, and then before each cell sets the new state, they have to wait that the neighbors have also calculated the number of live neighbors. And so OpenMP is pretty much designed for this type of stuff. So you just put some pragmas, so then this is parallel and then this is parallel. But you have to wait that all of this is calculated before you can move on to this. So for simple programs, OpenMP can work extremely well in the best case. But then there are more complicated programs. So you have, first of all, you have n equations, then each of them has several variables, and then the data dependency between different cells is not symmetric. So for example, the adaptive mesh refinement, the smaller cells, they don't need the data from as far away as the big cells and stuff like that. And also depending on which solver or which implementation of a solver you're using, the distance from which you have to wait the data also is different. and also the time steps between different models or equation sets can be different, and also the number of iterations for each step can change, and also the number of floating point operations can be quite different. And so for this type of a system, OpenMP is not really suitable. It's, well, you can't really do this efficiently with just pragmas. And also I took a look at the, what was it, Intel's thread building blocks. So they did seem to have, well, basically the only thing that seemed to be relevant for this is the general graph task parallelism thingy, but it seemed a bit too low level. So you have to yourself fiddle with pointers and then make sure they are all correct. So that in any case, if you want to write something, or well, write some kind of a maybe library to do this more easily, you still have to write something, and I don't think I would use, for example, TBB to write that kind of a library. But well, luckily C++11 brought the standard threads, and so one thing I noticed was it last year's C++ Now there was an interesting presentation titled Thread Safe and Thread Neutral Bag. So basically you just have a bunch of integers which you then fetch, and then based on that you do something. So that seems to be, or seem to be something that I might use if when I write something which would kind of help me handle these kinds of systems. And I also noticed that there, I think that on Friday there is a presentation also with the metastate machine and then some threading, was it ASIO or something. And so yeah, basically, well, in the complex enough case, you have a write time task graph. So basically the solver or the math, how it goes, what has to be done, in what order. And then you might have some compile time task graph also. So for example, the number of dimensions or how you coupled the different equations or stuff like that. And then you have the runtime task graph of actually which cells do you have and what are their neighbors and what are the sizes and stuff like that. So yes, all of wait, apply, wait, and repeat. And then somewhere in between you adapt the grid and maybe move some cells to different processes to make the system run faster, and then maybe change the approximation also. So yeah, in like the longer simulations, you take like 1 million iterations of this solve, wait, apply, wait, and then again, and then do something else in between. Then and now, or now and then. And so one thing is that you can't really constantly recreate the task graph after each iteration. It has to kind of stay there and you just go through it again and again. And I haven't found this kind of thing anywhere yet. And also like these first two, they are very likely, I don't think these are actually premature optimization, because if you leave all of this to runtime, then it will be too slow. That would be my guess. So yeah, not easy. And well, yeah, this load balancing or domain decomposition. So basically, yeah, so here you see like color coded. Each cell is owned either by, well, blue or red process. And well, since this is from a test case I use, so then the cells change processes randomly. So in order to get a fast solution, you wouldn't use this kind of load balancing, but this is just an example, and this is very good for testing. And well, here you see the usual glider going through the system, and so basically the steps are, so first you solve, then you maybe adapt the grid and balance the load, and then update the neighbor data so you can calculate the next solution, and so on. So what can make this difficult is that first of all the size of the cells can vary by a factor of 1000. And so in some parts of the volume you will have a lot of cells, and in others you will have very few. And also the number of sub-steps in each cell that you have to take to solve the next kind of big step, it also can vary by a factor of 1000. And then also the number of floating point operations you have to do for each iteration of each sub-step of each cell. So in the end, there can be a lot of, well, a factor of a million difference, I think, is not too far-fetched between like one specific point and some other point in the volume. So then kind of deciding how to balance, like, first of all, the flops between the cores and then the memory usage, because, well, if the simulation is lightweight in the amount of flops required, then you would like to gather as much stuff into one core as possible. But then, well, so then the memory also becomes a problem. And then also when you send stuff between processes, so you have to make, or you'd like to minimize also the amount of data sent during the updates. And also the load balancing itself costs something, so then this is can get quite tricky to try to optimize how to do this so that the time to solution is minimized. And so now for the frameworks, so basically everything before times n, or depending on how you implement it, n squared or n log n or something like that. So you have several different models which model different things, and then they have to kind of communicate with each other somehow. And well, there are also a lot of other things. So yeah, usually when you start looking at the big picture, you need more than one model to try to understand it, unless like you actually merge the codes of several models, but usually this is not very easy, or not even very hard, but almost impossible. And so yeah, the thing where the frameworks are good is if, well, each model can be a self-contained executable, for example, so they have their own equations and physical and computational assumptions and different solvers and, well, usually also developers. And actually notice that some of them were written before object-oriented programming even existed, so it's not entirely the physicists' fault that the models are how they are. But anyway, so these have been, I think, most popular in the weather climate research, where you have like the oceans and the atmosphere and all kinds of processes in there. And well, from a software development point of view, this is mostly like a data sharing problem. So you have to make the data from one model available to the other one in some hopefully easy way, so that they can do their thing. And so the good thing about the kind of frameworks which have been written on top of the separate models is that you don't have to really modify the separate models a lot. So basically, in the best case, you only have to write some additional functions which kind of convert the internal data into some intermediate format so it can be digested by the other model. And also the different models, they don't need as many features, so you can emulate many of the features I discussed previously with just the framework, then taking care of the nasty details, and so the model itself doesn't have to be modified at least that much. And also in some cases separate executables are also an advantage, or to be able to use separate executables for different parts of the model. And one thing that these frameworks also do is they interpolate the data. So you have different grids in different models, and maybe one is spherical and the other one is Cartesian and stuff like that. So then the frameworks usually also interpolate data. And these are, I guess, best maybe for coupling like write-only codes, which kind of no one can no longer understand, or the guy who originally wrote them is now retired or something like that. So it's kind of just touch the components as little as possible and then write all the required stuff on top. But well, there are also drawbacks. So well, first of all, it's an additional layer of indirection which could be done without, or might be nice to be able to do without. And also like this type checking by the compiler. So, well, you have to just be more careful when doing that. And also they require this intermediate representation of the data, so at least one extra copy has to be made. And also the conversion to and from the intermediate format, it's, well, both models convert to the same format and from the same format, so basically you have the same code in two different places, so that also can, well, an additional place for bugs. And in some cases, for example, if the simulation heavily uses global variables, so you can't even have like two copies of the same program running on the same process. So then, at least in that case, you need one extra transfer whenever you want to couple two models. And well, I think most of these can be avoided with C++11. So now, yeah, let's see. Some motivation for that. Well, yeah, generic programming, and also the nice thing about templates is that they are compile time, so you don't get any runtime overhead from them. And from what I have seen now, which I'll discuss a bit later or next, is that it's actually possible to write models separately and then just combine them without modifying any existing code at all, which I don't think is possible, for example, in Fortran or plain C. And so in this case, well, all of the previous testing and verification and validation you did for all of the separate components is still valid. So if you haven't modified them, so, well, yeah, kind of by definition. So when you want to couple something, you only write new code, and so then you also only have to kind of test that part separately, and then, well, the whole thing usually to see if the physics is correct and stuff like that. And also, at the best, you don't have to transfer anything extra, or you don't have to copy any extra stuff anywhere, so it's can be also nice for performance point of view. And so I don't know if this is actually enabled by the Variadic templates, but at least they made this easy enough so that even I could do it. I took a look at the Boost MPL, but I couldn't see how I could have done this with just MPL, so I don't know. Someone more knowledgeable might have been able to do, but I couldn't, so C++11 helped. So, okay. Well, you probably know the Variadic templates anyway. So, but one thing that I'd like to emphasize is that you don't decide the functionality when you write the code, but when you compile it. So, at least in kind of numerical modeling, this is an important distinction in some cases. So again, yeah. So the solvers. Just to remind you, so they take some data and then output the next state, and then the grid is the, well, discrete version of the volume, and it can also handle like the iteration over the neighbors and then transferring data between processes and stuff like that. And so the cell basically then it just stores all of the variables which are used by the model in the same volume, in the same place or unit. And actually this is a very powerful abstraction with the Variadic templates, as I'll hopefully show. So the thing that I've been working or will try to submit a publication about this, well, if not this month, then hopefully next month. So basically each variable is a template parameter which is just given to the cell class. And then the variables themselves only define the type of the data that will be used. So otherwise I forget what was that. There was some name for this type of class, so it doesn't have any internal state or methods or anything. Just in this case, just the one type def or using statement from the canonical Game of Life example. And so the kind of the serial implementation is almost trivial. So kind of last to or first to last. So in the last variable, then you just have some member which reserves the memory, and then operator provides access to it, and that's it. And for the variadic template case, then you reserve data for the first variable and then kind of inherit from the rest. So so basically at each level of the inheritance, space is allocated for the current variable and then access to it is provided by the operator, which is then overloaded by the class which represents the variable itself. So here's a game of life example again. So you somehow obtain the data of like one cell, and then when you apply the solution, so if it has like 3 live neighbors, then it becomes alive, or if it's different than 2, then the cell dies. So this is basically the syntax then. And so with variadic templates, then you can have an arbitrary number of whatever types of variables you want. Well, the minimum recommended is 1000. I think that should be enough for everyone. Well, if it's not, then the cell class also can be used recursively, so the cell class itself can be one of the variables. And so it doesn't restrict the types of the variables in any way, and also their names, so the user can decide how to call the variables and what they are actually. And so one nice thing is that models which use different variables, they can't really affect each other in any way by definition. Well, there is one exception. So if you default construct one cell and then assign it, so then all the previous initialization that was done by the previous code is kind of lost, because now you default constructed the cell and then started again. So this is maybe the only thing that should be avoided. But in every other way, it's kind of, extremely modular code. So by definition, the different parts can't affect each other. So it's, eases testing and validation and stuff like that a lot. And this doesn't have an impact on performance. So I tested a game of life simulation against a version which just used the regular structure with a bool and an int. So the difference was like less than 1% in the time to solution. And I actually think this generic simulation cell case was a bit faster, but anyway, not much difference. And actually the larger difference is if you switch these around in the structure. So then the difference is like 10%. And it doesn't matter whether you use the generic cell or just a structure. If the int comes first, then it's slower, I think by about 10%. So the specific test was, 30,000 steps on a 10,000 compile time grid with periodic boundaries. So the runtime with the faster version was like 1.4 seconds. And then with other compilers, it was surprisingly much larger. So with Clang, it was over 3 seconds. And with Intel compiler, it was like 6 seconds. Which, I don't understand. But usually I use GCC anyway, so not a problem. And also now the solvers. So if you also give the variables that you want to use as template arguments to the solvers, then this allows you to actually copy-paste the code from different models into like a new CPP file. And then it will, should just work if you do it properly. So instead of what was it, a few slides ago, so you had the specific name that the user had for the variables. So instead of that, in the solver itself, you just have some arbitrary type that you then give to the cell class. And then the user who calls uses the solver, then just decides which variables to give here, which will then be used by the solver. And in this way, now the solvers also, they don't restrict the variables that should be used and also their names in any way. So code can be reused very easily. And so then in the main program, so this is how you call the generic cell. So you just give it a bunch of variables as a template parameter. And then in the solvers themselves, then you tell it which variables to use for each solver. So this now shows the game of life, and then there is basically an advection, so you have a set velocity field and then you just propagate stuff in the velocity field. But yeah, regardless of what each of these does, if they use different variables, so then they don't affect each other in any way, and so that can then kind of the coupling business you can do explicitly elsewhere. So large parts of the main function are actually identical between variables. So you initialize the simulator or the MPI and then the grid, and then when you update data between different processes, so if you have a good encapsulations for the grid, then you just call one function and then it does the update, and the rest of the code follows basically this pattern. So you start transferring the data, then you solve the system in the cells which don't have any kind of neighbors on other processes, and then you wait for the data of the remote cells to arrive, then you solve the rest of the local cells, then you apply the solution and wait some more and apply the solution also to the outer cells. And so all of this it's basically the same for each different model. And so then this code can be just copy pasted from separate main programs into the combined one. So for example, in the Game of Life program I don't have this part, and in the advection program I don't have this part. And so if I want to combine them, then I just put them both here. And yeah, so if they have been written properly, then you can just copy paste stuff and it will just work. So yeah, no additional work needed. So then you can proceed directly to more kind of productive things like coupling, or actually trying to understand the physics of the problem, or then optimizing the code if it's too slow. And so one nice thing is that if you want to combine n different models, it doesn't require, it might require some modified code, but in this example it doesn't require any code, modified code, and then the just order of n copy pasting into the final executable. And also if you want to couple some of the codes together, if it's simple, then it's also simple in the code. So let's say I have a simulation which propagates or flies particles around in a volume based on some externally set velocity field. And so here I say that, okay, use this velocity, or usually I use this velocity, but then if I want, I can just switch this line and then it will use some other model's velocity which have been calculated somewhere else. So in this simple case, it's simple to couple. Complex cases will require more code, but it's still probably easier than what has been available before. So one important thing is for this cell class is to support also distributed memory programming, so basically MPI. And so this now assumes that some functionality is divided between the grid and the cells. So basically the grid decides what to send and where from which process, between which cells. And then the cell class itself decides actually what variables to send if something has to be sent. And so the user can choose for each variable separately, should this variable be sent or not when the next update is done. And also it can be decided either like one function call to send between all cells, or then on a cell-by-cell basis. So the logic here is that if this static function, or if the result of the static function con is neither true nor false, then each cell decides or by itself whether it will send some variables or not. So, this has been enough for anything that I have been doing so far or plan to do in the near future. And so then what the grid does is if it decides that, okay, now this or these two cells are neighbors and they reside on different processes, so the data should be exchanged. Or actually if it's asymmetric, then just, some data should be transferred. So then it just calls the get MPI data type function of each cell, or the cells which have to be sent or received. and then the cell returns the required information based on which variables the user wants to transfer. And so this is basically the MPI API. So there is some buffer and then some data type, and then some number of these data types are sent from address starting here. And so this required a bit or more complex logic, because the serial version is almost trivial. It's like, I don't know, 10, 20 lines of code, but this requires maybe 100 or few hundred more. So basically, this is the public function. This is called by whoever wants to send the data. And then this just dispatches to the implementation, which is on the next slide. So basically, this function fills up an array of the addresses and counts and types of each of the variable. And so if this current variable is to be transferred, then it fills up the current index with the required information, and then increments the index by once the current position is already filled, and then it calls the same implementation but in the inherited version of the cell now for the rest of the variables. So basically all of these are iterated at compile time through, and then at runtime decided then if these are added to the final transfer info or not. And so I suspect that this part could have been also done by MPL, but I couldn't figure out how. It just kind of was easier with these variadic templates, at least. And also the performance impact is, not measurable, at least in this simple game of life tests. Especially, initially the arrays which collect this information, initially they were vectors, and so then each recursive iteration pushed back some more info, and actually pushed back some more info. So that was actually quite slow. But now I switched to standard array, so then their size is decided at compile time, so then that's fast. And so some things that I'd still like to add. I think, this seems a bit tricky. So previously I had the bracket operator to return a reference to one cell or one variable's data. So what would be nice would be if a user could give several variables, and then the operator or this operator would return a reference to all of them. But I don't know. At least I couldn't make this work with a little effort because, first of all, the return type, let's see, it's the requested variables, and then you have to return a tuple of, these, and then you have to fill it up somehow. So I don't know, this seemed a bit tricky to do, actually. I suspect that it's possible, but And also this recursive use of the cell class. So if the cell class itself is a variable in some other cell class, so at the moment you would have to, or the user would have to call set transfer, or decide whether to transfer the variable, and then decide whether to transfer any of its variables. And if you want to transfer everything, then you have to go through the whole chain. So that's a bit tedious. So this is one thing that it would be nice to be able to just call one function and then have it do, or if the variable happens to have other variables inside, then all of those would also be transferred recursively. So right. So to conclude, Space Plasma is very complex from just the physics point of view, but also from the computational point of view. So so computational modeling is essential in many cases. So there has been a lot of theoretical mathematical work, but for example, space weather prediction and stuff like that, you can't really do that analytically. So you have to have a computational model for that. And so due to the complexity, all kinds of approximations are mandatory, pretty much. And what the variadic templates bring is that, you can develop the models very flexibly, and you can experiment with a lot of things, and well, they save a lot on then the development time, but especially then testing and validation and stuff like that. And well, you still get high performance code since it's compile time logic. And well, the work in progress code for the general simulation cell that I presented, it's available here. And yeah, so if you have any questions, yeah, I'd be happy to try to answer. So yeah, thank you. Yeah.
MPI comes with two sets of functions, that ones are synchronous and ones are asynchronous. This is not a question, more like a comment, or whatever you say. Have you had the chance to experiment with synchronous MPI calls with new C++11 thread libraries combined?
Yeah, so the question was that the MPI library also comes with synchronous and asynchronous calls, and have I had time to experiment with the synchronous API of MPI using the threading facilities of the C++11.
I have no idea
and
which one is more.
Yeah, I have not. But actually, probably the nastiest thing about that is that in practice, MPI doesn't support threading. So at least the last I checked, which was last year, none of the implementations were really thread safe. So basically it's, at least you can as long as you use one thread to call MPI functions, then you should be okay. But in some cases, you even have to have only the same thread calling the functions always. So yeah, I would leave the threading stuff to C++. So anything else? Yes?
You were talking a lot about that you want to adapt how the model is behaving, how granularity of calculations based on something interesting is going on at location. So how do you decide that something interesting is going on?
Yeah, so the question was that I talked about a lot of the granularity of the computation, and so how do I decide if something interesting is happening somewhere? So I would have to, so I'd like to use more resources to calculate that region. So that's a research topic on its own. So in practice, in the models that I've been using, the decision is based on kind of local gradients of different variables. So if, for example, if the density changes a lot in some region, then then just put some more cells in there and so or kind of resolve the area better, and that usually seems to work pretty well. But for these more complex cases, for example, let's see if I wonder which. Yeah, so for example here, then if kind of switching between this fluid approach and then just the ion approach where you follow single ion or ion trajectories, this is still an open research question, which hopefully I will be able to address in some or to some extent this year. Yes.
Just out of curiosity, for instance, how much RAM do you use when you run a typical simulation?
Yeah, the question was how much RAM. The answer is as much as there is.
How much is there?
Well, usually there seems to be about 1 gigabyte per core, 1 to 2. That's I think the usual what's available in the supercomputers. So, if you these fluid approaches they are very light also from the memory point of view. So these are these are more CPU bound. But for example, these kinetic codes, you have either a lot of particles or then you well, let's say just, you have a lot of particles, like thousands of particles at best in each cell, and then you have like millions of cells or more. So then it's, well, the total amount of memory required is, well, terabytes easily. So then you actually, you need many nodes in the supercomputer and many cores with about 1 gigabyte of memory for each core. Yeah.
So what was about the number of grid cells that you had? Was it on the order of 1 million cells?
The number of grid cells, well, it depends. For real-time stuff, it's a bit less, so maybe 500,000 or 200,000 or stuff.
How long did it take you to do an adaptive refinement?
Well, the adaptive refinement in itself, it's not that costly, but it's just the current grid implementation that I wrote. It still requires all-to-all communication between all the processes whenever the structure of the grid changes. So that doesn't scale too well. Let's say like, well, around maybe 400 cores or processes, it starts to kind of level off the time to solution or the number of cells calculated per second. But, well, one nice thing, at least for space weather predictions, is that you don't have to refine the grid very often. So the length of the time step is, well, let's say 20 milliseconds, but then you only have to refine the grid like, I don't know, every second or 2 seconds or something like that. So you can take, well, about 100 steps between each mesh refinement, so it's not that costly. But, yeah.
In low-density gas dynamics problems, you'll have a particle represent a large number of actual gas molecules. Is something similar like that happening here?
Yeah, so the question was that or comment was that in gas dynamics, or what was it, low pressure, there is like one particle actually represents more than one molecule. Well, same thing here. So if you reduce the number of particles by 20 orders of magnitude, then the weight of the simulation particles is something like, well, for one case it was like milligram particles, so which is about 20 orders of magnitude more heavy than kind of the actual protons which they model. But, well, so this, well, another name for this is like cloud, or kind of cloud particles or particle clouds. But so it's kind of not really feasible to model actually each and every proton in the system, as you need tons of memory, and then maybe in 60 years that would be possible, but not for a long time still. So any other comments, questions? Okay, well, thank you.